Well, good evening, Brennan, and welcome to the Lodge Hope of Karachi number 337 and our weekly lockdown lecture series. This is Zoom meeting number 55, Brennan, but more importantly, it is the first anniversary of our lockdown lecture series. We started this as a test on Sunday, the 23rd of March 2020 with a few members of the Lodge to see if this would be a viable platform to help our Brennan with their daily advancement. Little did any of that small group of Brennan that Sunday evening think that we would, over the course of the next 52 weeks, extend the name of the Lodge Hope of Karachi right around the globe, from New Zealand to Chile and every pair in between. And it's been a great pleasure, Brennan, to welcome you all here and to our Facebook pages and to our YouTube channel. As ever, Brennan, can I remind you of the Grand Lodge of Scotland guidelines that we need to keep your video on and a recognisable name. That is very much appreciated. And please, can you sign our virtual tile? I've challenged the Brother Secretary to come up with some numbers for me on how many people have attended over the last 55 meetings, and I'll share with you those numbers at the end of the meeting. Before moving on, however, Brennan, I think it's only fitting that as the rest of the nation are taking time out of their busy diaries to have a moment of reflection on what has happened over the past year, that we here at the Lodge Hope of Karachi Lockdown Lecture Series, we also recognise that day of reflection. The numbers, Brennan, are quite horrific. They're numbers we've never seen in peacetime. There's been 126,284 UK deaths. There's been 4,307,304 UK cases. And around the world, those numbers just increase manyfold. Our Brennan, we've lost so many Brennan over the last 12 months. Too many to name individually here this evening. But as we take this moment to reflect back on what has been this devastating, traumatic year of COVID-19, can I ask you to think about those Brennan that you knew and their families, and those that are still suffering from the terrible impact of COVID-19. Please, Brennan, bow your heads and take a moment. Thank you, Brennan. One of the privileges, Brennan, as a master of any lodge, is that you get to make some decisions that are favourable to yourself. And what I've tried to ensure over the last year, that we've had a wide range of speakers that are fit for purpose, that will interest and entertain and allow us all to have a daily advancement. But as many of you know, that I do have a personal interest in Freemasonry and the military and everything that's associated with that. And in particular, an interest, as have two or three of the other Brennan on the lockdown lecture this evening, an interest in the Victoria Cross. And I thought, who better who can I ask that can come along and fulfill some of the areas that I would like to have a daily advancement in. And I'd come across this brother. I found out he was a Freemason, an English Freemason, and that he was prepared to come along and give Zoom presentations. Worshipful Brother Mark Smith, he's the Provincial Grand Orator at the Provincial Grand Lodge of Essex. He's also the Assistant Grand Swordbearer in the United Grand Lodge of England. Now, his Masonic credentials will speak for themselves, but for many of you, he will be better known as the man on the telly on a Sunday night, looking at the medals in the militaria. And over the last 3 or 4 weeks, Brother Mark Smith, I've been teasing the Brennan with, didn't tell them who you were or who was coming to be our guest speaker, and I gave them a variety of clues around the Antiques Roadshow, some snippets, one including our own past Grand Master Mason, Marcus Humphrey of Dinnet, who starred on the show, or I should say his car starred on the Antiques Roadshow. But it's a great delight to welcome Brother Mark Smith, who's a renowned medalist and curator of all things arms and militaria, to us this evening. I can't quite believe some of the things I've read about you, Mark, that you've been collecting for 47 years. You look as young as I do. And I'm sure we've got a couple of gunners on here that will probably want to ask you some questions about your role as curator of the Royal Artillery Museum at some point. But Bren, as ever, there will be an opportunity to ask questions to our speaker, and I would encourage you to do so in the chat box, and we will have our question and answer session afterwards. At this point, it gives me the greatest of pleasure to hand the floor over to this evening's guest speaker, Worshipful Brother Mark Smith.
Well, thank you very much for that, and good evening, everybody. I have to say that you've been very kind to me there by saying 47 years, because I think now we've moved on a bit in time, and we're now looking at me collecting medals for 51 years. So it has been a lifetime passion, this thing. Some of which you'll find out tonight. And in fact, this all starts really because on Friday afternoons, I used to leave school quite early. And instead of going home, I was taken down to see my nan, my dad's mum, who was a very Victorian lady who lived in a very Victorian house. And in the front room, there was a sideboard. And in that sideboard was a little wooden box which contained the medals that had been awarded to my dad, who was an air gunner in World War II in the Royal Air Force. He actually completed 65 operations as an air gunner, and his medals lived in this little box. And I used to take them out every Friday, along with his air gunner's badge and bits and pieces. And then at the end of the afternoon, put them all back in the box. And this afternoon, back in 1969, my nan said to me, "You really like these, don't you? So if you promise to look after them, you can take them home." You probably should know at this point, just to give you some idea, that I was 6 years old in 1969. But I very proudly took this box home. I went into my bedroom and I laid out my first ever medal display. And at some point, Dad said, "What are they?" And I told him, and he was interested and stuff. When Dad left the Air Force, he became a school teacher, then a headmaster. And in 1967, he was made a professor at the London University, and he ran the education department. And he had this magical knack for being able to teach you stuff without you ever realizing he was teaching you, because he made it such fun. And if he found a vehicle that interested you, he would go with it. And because he saw I liked medals, we got a book. We got various members of the family gave me a couple of more medals. And then one day, Dad came home with a poster. The poster had every medal on it from 1799 to 1973. And along the top row were all of the Gallantry awards. But we had a few medals by then. So what we did is we put the poster on the wall and we ticked off the medals that we had already got. And then we stepped back and we looked at it. And between us, we said, one day we shall collect all of them. Now, the one in the top left-hand corner of that poster was the Victoria Cross. And that one was always going to be the most difficult one to get hold of. As time went by, and in 2003, I was made the curator of the Royal Artillery Museum down in Woolwich. And there were a few things in the museum to do with the Victoria Cross, which prompted me to go away and try and find out more about this incredible little medal. Not least the fact that on the first Wednesday I was there, they handed me a metal box out of the armory. And when I opened it, there were 23 Victoria Crosses inside it. And that really did spur me on to think, do you know what? I'm going to have to talk about this professionally now. So I better I better find out a bit more. And really, that's where our talk comes from. So our talk will actually now start in 1854. And 1854 is the year that the Crimean War started. We sent an expeditionary force to the Crimea of British soldiers who, if you had met them in the street, the lovely, gentle people that you are, you would have crossed the road to get away from them, because you would have considered all soldiers of that period as the scum of the earth. In 1820, 5 years after the Battle of Waterloo, Lord Wellington said of his own men, they are the scum of the earth. They fight like lions, but they are the scum of the earth. And that's really how you perceived soldiers of the day, not officers, but the other ranks. You joined the army in three ways. The first was that you were given an option by a magistrate: prison or the army. Secondly, you went one evening after a long day in the field or in the new factories to your local hostelry, your local pub. And when you got there, there were three men outside dressed in red uniforms. One had a drum, one had a flag, and the other one was wearing a red sash across his uniform. And that man with the red sash was very friendly. And he took you into your pub and he stood you a pint of beer and he engaged you in conversation and he stood you another pint of beer. And at some point during that evening, as the beer and the conversation flowed, he pressed into the palm of your hand a shilling, the sovereign shilling. And at that moment, you were in the British Army. When you woke up in the morning, you had a headache, yes, but you didn't have a shilling, because recruiting is thirsty work, and that sergeant had helped you to drink your shilling, but by God, you were in the army. The third way was that you, in their words, went for a soldier. So you volunteered. You went down to your local barracks or to a barracks that you could get to. You said you wished to join. They gave you a very rudimentary medical. You signed or made your mark on your papers, and they gave you the sovereign shilling, and you were then in the British Army. In 1854, it was these men that we sent to the Crimea to fight the Russians. Now, if we think about wars today, or actually anything, last night I was watching a television program and I turned over onto CNN, and it was live coverage of the shooting in Colorado. And that's how we see our news, instant from anywhere in the world. But for a Victorian man or woman, news came through a newspaper. It was anything up to 3 months old when it arrived. And the places that they were talking about, particularly for some of the wars, were so mysterious that you would have had to have found an atlas to try and find out where these places were. The Crimean War, however, is our first attempt at a technologically advanced war. An electric telegraph had been laid from London down to the coast, under the channel into France, down it was extended into the Balkans, and then up into the Crimea itself. And this was a Morse code relay set of stations, which allowed the force commander in the Crimea, a man called Lord Ragland, to be able to send a Morse code message through these relay stations from the Crimea to London, which is getting on for about 3,000 miles away, and receive within a sort of 16 to 20 hour period a reply from London. And in 1854, that is almost real-time control from London on a battlefield thousands of miles away. With the expeditionary force, we sent two men. One was a man called Mr. Russell. He was a reporter for the Times newspaper. And the other man was a guy called Roger Fenton. And Roger Fenton was a photographer. Mr. Russell was allowed to use the electric telegraph once a week to send back a dispatch to the Times newspaper in London. And Roger Fenton was allowed to use the returning transport ships to send back the glass plate negatives of his photographs, which were then published in the Illustrated London News. On the 25th of October, 1854, the Light Brigade charged into the valley. On the 6th of November, 1854, that story was in the newspaper. That's so fast for their day. That's almost instant reporting. And in that week's edition of the Illustrated London News, there was also one of Roger Fenton's photographs, now turned into an etching of the actual valley that they had charged along, still dotted with the cannonballs that the Russians had fired at. Now, Mr. Russell's story of the charge is spectacular. You can find it on the internet. It is spectacular. All of his stories were brilliant. He was really good at this. And if you imagine yourself as a Victorian gentleman, it's November 1854, you're sitting in your house by your fire in your favorite leather armchair, and you've got the Times, and you start to read the story of the charge of the Light Brigade. Well, through his words, you can feel your horse moving underneath you. You can hear the jingling of the bits. You start to move in your chair slightly forward as they started to move. And when that 14-year-old lad blows the charge, you sort of lean forward in your chair and you go with them down that valley. It is an incredible story. The reading of it lasts for 7 minutes. The actual charge of the Light Brigade lasted for 7 minutes. So it's almost a real-time piece of prose for what happened in their time the week before. And that is almost unheard of in their day. And as more and more stories like that from Mr. Russell came back to England, the general idea about what people thought about soldiers started to change. And instead of saying, well, they're the scum of the earth, they started to say, these lads are Her Majesty's soldiers and sailors. Therefore, they must be the best in the world. And look how brave some of our lads are. When you read these stories, things only happened last week. How brave our boys are, and bless them, how many of them are dying, to uphold the honour of the country. What reward is there? The question was asked for the types of acts of bravery that we are seeing in the paper. If a soldier or a sailor is very brave, what reward is there for this act of bravery on the battlefield? And this sort of question got momentum, and it went to the House of Commons. And the House of Commons answered it by saying, well, in 1854, the Army instituted a medal called the Distinguished Conduct Medal. It is the highest award for bravery for the Army for other ranks. And the public said, that's pretty good. And they said, not to be outdone, in January 1855, the Royal Navy instituted the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, the highest award for bravery for other ranks in the Royal Navy. And the public said, well, that is very good. What about officers? And they said, well, officers, we do have a bit of a problem with officers. First of all, they are supposed to be brave. That's what officers are. If they're going to get sort of mentioned to us as a brave act, then it's going to have to be something which is above and beyond that we would already expect of them. But our real problem is we don't have anything to give them. There is something called the Companion of the Bath, but it's not really for bravery, and it doesn't quite work. So the public said, well, we believe that what there should be is one reward, the ultimate award for bravery on the battlefield. It should be available to the Army and the Navy and should cover all ranks. Now, this is a concept went from the House of Commons to the House of Lords, and it eventually ended up on the desk of a man called Lord Panmure, who was a Freemason, who was the Secretary of State for War. And it was he who got the task of taking the idea for the greatest award for bravery we could have to Her Majesty Queen Victoria. What he actually got was an audience with Prince Albert. He went in, he met the Prince, he took paperwork with him, which explained what the public were asking. He gave the paperwork to the Prince and said to him, look, this is what the people are asking for, the ultimate award for bravery for soldiers and sailors. And Prince Albert said, I think Her Majesty will be very interested in this, so I will show her your paperwork, and then I will invite you back to the palace. So just about a month later, Lord Panmure was asked to go back to the palace. He met again with Prince Albert, and now on the desk in front of Prince Albert, laid out in front of the Prince, were all of the papers that Lord Panmure had bought the month before. But now, as Lord Panmure looked at the paperwork, he could see that every single page had been annotated in green ink handwriting, the hand of Queen Victoria herself. And on the very first page at the top, Her Majesty had written the Victoria Cross. So she told us what it would be called, and she told us what it would look like. It would be a cross. She had annotated every page, but in the margin of one page, she had written, I do not want this medal to be made of something precious. I do not want this medal to be worth money, because it's not about the medal. It's about the deed behind the medal. That's the important thing. Prince Albert said to Lord Panmure, Her Majesty is very excited, and what she would like you to do is to go away and then come back again with 4 examples, 4 models that Her Majesty can choose from. However, Her Majesty has seen one medal. It is called the Army Gold Cross. It was in use between 1808 and 1814 in the Peninsular War, and it was only for officers. It is what is called a cross pate. So it is a cross, but the top arms of the cross are wide and they narrow as they come to the middle, and all 4 arms do that. Now, on the Army Gold Cross, there is a lion, a separate piece, which is brazed onto the front, a little lion, and there's another one on the back. And the exciting thing about this thing is that it is made of solid 22 karat gold. I weighed one of these things once and phoned up one of those cash for gold places and said to the woman, how much will you give me for this block of gold? And on that day's spot price, with all of the bits and the hangers, she was looking at giving me something in the region of £80,000 just for the block of gold. They are incredible things. They went away, they came back with some models, and one of them was a cross pate, a little bit smaller than the Army Gold Cross. The lion now was part of the design, and he was standing on a crown, and underneath the crown there was a banner, and on that banner he had put the words, for bravery. Her Majesty went through all of the models, and this one caught her eye, and she chose this cross pate with the lion and the crown. And she looked at it and said, this is the one, but this wording, for bravery, this will not do. All of my soldiers and sailors are brave. I want it to say, for valour. And they are the only 2 words on the front of the cross. Her Majesty then said, how will you join the cross to the ribbon? And they said, well, Your Majesty, the ribbon will end in some sort of a metal bar, from which there will be a loop, and then there will be a ring, and maybe another hole in the top of the medal. And Her Majesty said, well, I want you to incorporate into that suspension device the letter V for Victoria. So the next time you get to see a Victoria Cross in the newspaper or on the telly, have a look, and just where the bar ends, there's a V and it has a ring through it, and that's what goes through the top of the cross. Her Majesty then said, what can we make it of? And they said, well, Your Majesty, what would you like us to make it of? As she had said before, I do not want this made of something precious. So she said, could we make it of copper? I said, yes, Your Majesty, of course. They went away and they came back with a copper version of the cross. They showed Her Majesty the cross. And just to sort of show you how much she was involved with this, she looked at the copper Victoria Cross that they'd given her, and she said, this will not do. My soldiers and sailors will be very proud of this medal, and they will polish it, and it will go pink, and it will look like an old penny. What else can we make it of? And someone said to her, what about bronze, Your Majesty? They went away. They came back with a bronze version of the cross. Her Majesty said, that's the one. And on the 26th of January, 1856, she signed the statute that created the Victoria Cross. Now, a man from the palace got the job of going out into London to try and find a jeweler to make the Victoria Cross. Probably something he thought would be quite a simple task. But what actually happened is that when he got to the jewelers and told them what was wanted, in that it was going to be made of bronze, one of the jewelers actually said to him, we're professionals. We don't do that. Go away. And he did, bless him. And he wandered the streets until he came across a jeweler's, brand new really. It had been open for 5 years. It was on the corner in London of New Bond Street and a place called Bruton Street. Today, it's a clothes shop. But in those days, it was a jeweler's, and it was run by a man called Mr. Hancock. He went in, he met Mr. Hancock, and he said to him, would you be interested in making a medal for Her Majesty? Now, Mr. Hancock, been open 5 years, could probably see over his shoulder, as it were, the by appointment sign appearing in his window. And being a fairly shrewd businessman, bless him, he said yes. And making him quite famous, really, because the only two jewelers that most people have ever heard of are Hancock's and Fabergé. So he made himself a world-known jeweler in one fell swoop by being the man who would make the Victoria Cross. Now, on the 26th of June, 1857, the first 62 men who had been awarded the Victoria Cross lined up in Hyde Park so that Her Majesty Queen Victoria could present them with their medals. Now, as we all know, the medals are made from bronze, taken from a cannon captured from the Russians at Sevastopol. So, when I got the job at the Royal Artillery Museum, I phoned up Hancock's, the jewelers, and I said to them, can I come down and talk to someone about Victoria Crosses? And I met a lovely man called David Callahan, managing director at the time. And I spent a fantastic afternoon with him, really, really good. And he showed me everything, all of the ledgers. They have these big leather-bound books which give you not only the names of all the men who had won the VC, but there's another little book that gives you the engraving on the back, because that's a secret. Then there's the name of the man who would supply the ribbons, the name of the man who would supply the cardboard boxes that they would be put in, the name of the man who supplied the steel pins, come back to them in a bit, and the name of the man who would engrave the details on the back at a farthing a letter. The detail is incredible. And I said to David, this is wonderful, absolutely incredible. Where is the paperwork for the arrival of the cannon captured from the Russians that these things are made from? And he said to me, well, they're not actually made of Russian cannons. I said, what do you mean? We all know that that's what they're made. He said, yeah, we all know that's what they're made of, but actually they're not. They were just made of a stock piece of bronze. It may have been a cannon at some time, but it wasn't given to us. It wasn't captured from the Russians. It was just a piece of bronze. And I left crestfallen, truly. Okay, so we go back now to the 26th of June, 1857. However, the week before, the 18th of June, 1857, there was a column written in the Times newspaper about the medal parade. And in it, it says, next week, Her Majesty will present 62 of the new medals, the Victoria Cross. They are made of a very mean piece of metal. They are made of bronze taken from a cannon captured from the Russians at Sevastopol. So this concept that we all know and love is actually just a newspaper story. In today's world, it is fake news, but that's all it ever was, a newspaper story. Okay, so here we go, back to the parade. 62 men are lined up. Now, you've got to know a couple of things at this point. They are genuinely the first 62 men because there are no posthumous Victoria Crosses. It says in the statute that you still have to be alive at the end of the action to claim your cross. So if you're wounded in an action, you're recommended for a VC, and you die before that gets signed off, no VC. You got one line in the London Gazette that said, would have been awarded the Victoria Cross had he lived. So there are no posthumous VCs. The ribbons for the Victoria Cross are red for the Army and blue for the Royal Navy. And they remained red and blue until the 1st of April 1918, when the Royal Air Force was formed. And they went to King George V and they said to him, what colour would you like for the Royal Air Force VC ribbon? And he said, I want them all to be red from now on. And he really upset the Royal Navy because they were very proud of their little blue ribbons. Her Majesty had been told that she would arrive by carriage and that the men would be standing in front of her and a cushion would arrive next to Her Majesty, and on the cushion would be the man's Victoria Cross. At the top of the ribbon, at the back, a bit like a Masonic jewel, there would be a bar from which there would be not one but two steel spikes, 1.5 inches long. Her Majesty was told to pick up the Victoria Cross from the cushion, place her thumb on that metal bar, put the two spikes onto the gentleman's coat and press, and she would award him his Victoria Cross. They had practiced all week in front of the dais where Her Majesty would be. And on the big day, Her Majesty arrived on time, but not in a carriage. She came riding a horse, riding side saddle. She got to the dais. She did not dismount. She sat next to the dais on her horse. The parade shuffled a bit to their left. And the first man in the queue was a man called Commander Raby, Royal Navy. And he was given, he's not the first man to win it, that was Midshipman Lucas, but he was the first man in the queue. He was given the nod. He set off. He came smartly to attention before Her Majesty and the horse. The cushion arrived. Her Majesty picked up the VC. She leant down, put the two steel pins onto his jacket and pressed, just as the horse moved. And she pressed those two steel pins straight into his chest. They carried him off of parade, laid him down on the floor, undid his jacket and watched the blood spread across his lovely white shirt. And he had two quotes from the day. The first was, I did not feel I could make a fuss as Her Majesty gave me the highest award for bravery. And his second quote that day was, I was more badly injured receiving it than I was winning it. Bless him. 9th of October, 1862, out on the China station. 4 ships. One of the ships was called HMS Sphinx. On board HMS Sphinx was a man called able seaman George Hinckley. The force commander asked for volunteers from the 4 ships to form what was called a naval landing party, which would go inland and make an attack on what turned out to be a walled city called Fenghua. George volunteered. He marched inland with his compatriots. They got to Fenghua, and when they got there, they found that it was huge. The actual wall in front of them was about 200 yards long, in the middle of which was a gate, and along the top were castellations with Chinese defenders poking between them. In front of the gate and the wall, again about 200 yards wide and about 200 yards deep, was a completely empty, flat market square. No cover, nothing, just a flat square. Down the left-hand side of this square were shops and houses, and down the right-hand side was broken ground and a stream, so very difficult to maneuver on. But at about the 200-yard mark from the gate, there was a ditch. The sailors got into the ditch, they got themselves ready, the whistles blew, and they made a frontal assault across this open square, and they met murderous fire. They fell back under fire. It was chaos. When the gun smoke cleared, right out in the middle of the square was a wounded sailor. And as he started to wave for help, all of the Chinese on the wall started to shoot at him. George Hinckley saw this, and George, of his own idea, climbed out of the ditch under fire, and he ran the 100 yards to the wounded man, picked him up, put him over his shoulder, and ran him back to the ditch. Not content with that, we are told that he then pushed his way along the ditch, carrying the wounded man until he found the doctor and laid the wounded man at the feet of the doctor. George then turned round just in time now to see, at the gate, 200 yards distant, a wounded man. George climbed out of the ditch, and this time he ran the whole 200 yards under fire. Reached his wounded man, picked him up, put him over his shoulder, worked out he wouldn't get back to the ditch, but ran sideways across the battlefield and got him to one of the houses, and as it says in the citation for his Victoria Cross, to a place of safety. George was awarded the Victoria Cross, and it was presented to him in Hyde Park in London in January 1863 by Queen Victoria. And here is George's Victoria Cross. You can see for Valour, and you can now see the V for Victoria and the lion standing on the crown. And a blue ribbon because George was a sailor. Now, in the Indian Mutiny, which was lasted from 1857 to 58, there was a lad called Cornet, which is a rank, William Banks. He was in the 7th Hussars. He was in the cavalry. He had joined the cavalry when he was 19 years old, 2 years before. He'd been sent to India in end of 1857 when the mutiny was on. He'd been in a couple of skirmishes, and now he found himself in a move towards Lucknow, what was known as the second relief column. They moved towards Lucknow on the 19th of March 1858, and they came across a little encampment really outside of something called the Musa Bagh, which is a bagh is a gate. So it was one of the gates to the city of Lucknow, and bizarrely I've actually been there. So an incredible place, but just outside there was this little village. No one really took much notice of it. The 7th Hussars were a covering party for some guns of the Royal Horse Artillery, 3 guns. They got to the gate, saw the village, didn't think much of it, and put themselves into a sort of a campment and started to cook food. And a party of the 7th Hussars was sent out to just reconnoiter the village. And amazingly, which no one expected, about 300 mutineers came out of the village and and attacked the cavalry, killing nearly all of them, and then went for the guns. The gunners stood around and defended their guns with, the ramrods, but it wasn't going well. And all on his own, William decided that he would repel the attack, mounted, drew his sword, and bless him, on his own, he rode into the mutineers. We're told that he cut down 3 or 4 of them before someone cut down his horse. He was dismounted. He put up a fight, bless him. And eventually some soldiers who were brought up for this purpose of removing these mutineers went forward, pushed the mutineers back, and there they found William. The actual report says grievously wounded. He had over 300 cut marks on him. They had cut his right arm off and his right leg, and he was still alive. They brought him back, they got him to the doctors, and the commander of the entire relief column put him in for the Victoria Cross. That recommendation came back to London. It takes a long time to come back from London. And whilst it was on its way, 19 days after the action on the 7th of April, 1858, William died. And then his recommendation arrived in London. It went to Queen Victoria. It was in all of the papers. And Queen Victoria said, that is amazing. But he can't have the Victoria Cross because he's dead. And the public said, but Your Majesty, look what he did. She said, no, I know, I've read it. It's absolutely incredible. But it says in the statute, you still have to be alive. His name, William Banks, was printed in the London Gazette saying would have been awarded a Victoria Cross had he lived, but he did not get his medal. Now, along with a couple of other guys called Lieutenants Coghill and Melville, who were at a place called Isandlwana, which is part of the film Zulu. Both of Coghill and Melville were Freemasons. They were killed in that battle as well. And the public petitioned Queen Victoria for the rest of her reign and the rest of her life for these men to receive the VC. And she said no. Edward VII came to the throne. He too was petitioned. And in 1907, he relented. And he changed the statute. He made the Victoria Cross posthumous. And then he backdated the Victoria Cross for William Banks, Lieutenant Coghill, and Lieutenant Melville, the 3 first men ever to receive a posthumous VC. Now, when we think about Victoria Crosses today, they are nearly always posthumous. Now, 7 years later from 1907 is 1914, and that is the start of the Great War. Between 1914 and 1918, 643 men won the Victoria Cross, and 211 of them were killed doing it. And out of that 643 men, 10%, 64 of them were Freemasons. That's quite an incredible feat. Something else happened in 1914, and that was that the block of metal that Hancock's the jewellers was using to make the Victoria Crosses from ran out. Hancock's wrote to the War Office and they said, what would you like us to use next? Now, the generals and the admirals at the War Office all knew the story that the VC, our highest award for bravery, was made from a captured enemy gun. And they quite liked that idea. So what they did was they sent a signal down to the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, where the Royal Artillery Museum was that I used to work at, and said that 2 guns must be found. They must be made of foreign manufacture. They must be made of bronze, and they must have been captured in the battle. And a man went out down at Woolwich Arsenal into what was called the captured gun park, and he chose 2 guns. And the bit that he cut off is called the button. So a cannon has the cannonball coming out at this end, and about here, there's a hole called the touch hole where you light the charge. And then if you think about it, when you look at a cannon next time, you'll see it goes thin, and then there's a lump. And that lump is the button. It's a counterweight. And he cut that off of both guns. And that is what the Victoria Crosses are made from. Now, when I was at the museum, my walk to my office every morning took me past, in the foyer of the museum, those two guns. So every day I walk past the two Victoria Cross guns that since 1914 have made just over 800 Victoria Crosses between them. But whilst I was at the museum, there was war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and lads were genuinely winning Victoria Crosses, British, Australian and New Zealanders. And if you were British, you went to meet Her Majesty and you were presented with your Victoria Cross. If you're Australian or New Zealand, you were presented with your Victoria Cross by your head of state at home, and then you were flown to London to meet Her Majesty. But whilst you were there in London, British, Australian or New Zealand, whatever, during that week when you were being awarded your VC by Her Majesty, at some point, all of the lads who got the VC between 2003 and 2015 came to the Royal Artillery Museum to see the two guns that the VCs were made from. And I got to meet all of them, and it was fantastic. And one of them, a guy called Ben Robert Smith, became a friend of mine. Now, Ben is an Australian. He's in the SAS. If he was here, the thing that you would notice most about him is that he is 6 feet 8.5 inches tall. Lovely man, truly lovely man. He won his VC in Afghanistan. And he said to me one day in 2015, he said to me, we're going to do a program on Australian television for Anzac Day. Would you be in my program and talk about the guns and the VCs? I said, of course I would, Ben. It's not a problem, mate. So the big day came, at Channel 7 Australian TV, me and Ben, and we stood between the two Victoria Cross guns. And I started to tell him the story of how the metal ran out. And we went over to what I used to call my right-hand gun and showed him where the button had been cut off, where the flat end of the gun was. And I said to Ben, this gun, when the block was cut off, that block of metal ran out in 1943. And the last Victoria Cross that this gun made was made for a man called Guy Gibson for the Dams raids. We moved over to the left-hand gun and I said, this gun, Ben, is the gun that has made your Victoria Cross. Now, I have to tell you, Ben, that these two guns were captured in 1860 at a place called the Taku Forts. The Taku Forts is in China, and these two guns are Chinese. Therefore, your VC was made in China, which is a very brave thing to say to a 6 foot 8.5 inch SAS man. And there is me and Ben. I'm 5'8". There is Ben, and we are standing next to the gun that his VC was made from. Now, on the 1st of July, 1916, the British Army attacked on the Somme. We had a 14-mile piece of front stretching north to south from a village called Serres in the north to a village called Maricourt in the south. It was a Saturday morning, the 1st of July, 1916, and they went over the top when the whistles blew that morning at 7:30. They lasted about an hour. At the end of the hour, there were 18,311 dead and 42,000 wounded men on that 14-mile front. The battle itself would last for 4.5 months. And at the end of the battle, there would be 500,000 dead and wounded on the battlefield. During that first hour of the battle, 9 men were awarded the Victoria Cross. One of them was a man called Lionel Reese. Now, Lionel was a bit different because Lionel was a fighter pilot in the Royal Flying Corps. He took off with a wingman that morning to fly over the battle. The wingman disappeared. And to this day, from 1916, he is still posted as missing and is on the memorial to the missing at Arras. But Lionel pressed on his own, and he saw a formation of British bombers coming back from the German side. And he thought to himself, I will go up and I will escort them home. Now, he got up in amongst these people, and there must have been a second where he thought to himself, I really must look in that book that tells you what German aircraft look like, because they were all German, and they all started to shoot at him. A bullet came through the side of his aircraft, remember their canvas, and severed his right leg through the thigh bone. And the bottom half of his now severed leg fell into the bottom of the aircraft. He rolled out of combat. He fished about inside the stump of what was left of his leg until he found the artery, the femoral artery, which he pulled out and closed with his thumb and forefinger. He then picked up the stump of his leg, put the foot back in the rudder pedal, holding the artery shut, joined the two stumps back together, and then flew back up into the combat. He shot down 2 Germans and only rolled away from the combat when he ran out of ammunition. He flew his little aeroplane home, made a really good landing, we're told. And what used to happen was his little dog used to run from the hut. He would jump out and they would meet sort of halfway. And on this occasion, the dog reached the aircraft. And the ground crew thought something wrong. They started to run. They got there, and Lionel, all 5'3" of him, is sitting there holding the 2 stumps of his leg together whilst holding out of his leg the femoral artery closed by his own hand. And they said to him, are you all right? And bless him, he said, I could do with a bit of help getting out. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. On the 31st of August, 1940, in the Battle of Britain, flying from an airfield called RAF Debden, which is about, 4 miles from where I'm sitting now, a guy called Jimmy Nicholson took off in his Hurricane. It was his first operational flight in the Battle of Britain. They went off as a squadron. It wasn't a scramble. He was told to familiarize himself as he flew around. He had a wingman with him, and neither of them saw a German Messerschmitt 110 come up behind them. The German came up, opened fire with 20mm exploding cannon shells and machine gun bullets. And Jimmy Nicholson said afterwards, it was the loudest bang I ever heard. The cannon shells had exploded in the cockpit. They had blown most of Jimmy's left foot off. They blinded him in the right eye, and they'd set light to his Hurricane. Now, avgas doesn't burn with a yellow flame and black smoke. It burns almost clear blue, so you can't really see it. And the instrument panel is about, about 12, 14 inches in front of you. It's made of aluminium. And Jimmy said, I knew I was on fire because my instrument panel started to melt. So he slid the hood back, opened the door, undid his harness, climbed out onto the wing, ready to bail out. And the German Messerschmitt 110 flew past him. So Jimmy didn't bail out. He climbed back in to his burning Hurricane. He said afterwards, I held the throttle open as wide as I could get it with my hand in the flames. I watched my glove burn off. I watched the skin burn off, and I watched the bones of my hand catch fire. And then I shot him down. He rolled his Hurricane. He bailed out. He was 70% burnt. And just to add insult to injury, when he landed, the Home Guard were waiting for him, and one of them shot him with a double-barrel shotgun. He'd lost his left foot, blind in one eye, 70% burnt, and a double-barrel shotgun. Bless him. He was in hospital until 1942. He was one of Archibald McIndoe's guinea pigs, the plastic surgeon. And Archibald McIndoe said to Jimmy one day, he said, this hand is ruined. So there's nothing we can do with this hand. So what we're going to do is we're going to do an operation and we're going to set it for you. So you've got some options. Do you want us to set it so that you can hold a pint of beer? Or maybe a cigar? What do you want? And Jimmy Nicholson said to Archibald McIndoe, can you set it so that I can hold the throttle quadrant on a Hurricane? And he did. And Jim shot down 6 more Germans before the war was over. The only Victoria Cross for the Battle of Britain. Now, if you go out onto the battlefield and you win a medal for bravery, there's not just Victoria Crosses, there's all sorts. They're in different levels. If you go out and you win one, and you go out, bless you, and you do it again, they don't give you 2 medals. What they do is they give you the first one, and then they give you a little strip of metal, and you sew that on the ribbon of the first one. And that bar represents the second award. Out of the 1,365 men who have won the Victoria Cross, 3 men have won it twice. The first man to do it was a man called Arthur Martin Leake. Now, Arthur was a doctor. The year was 1900. It was the Boer War. He was told there were 3 wounded men out in front of the guns. He went out to tend to them. He was seen by a Boer, and the Boer shot him 3 times with a rifle. And out of everybody now, Arthur is the most badly wounded. The stretcher bearers came out with 3 stretchers. They looked at Arthur. They tried to get him on. He said, "No, leave me. Leave me. The boys have been out longer. Take them in first." So they took them in. They came back for Arthur. They took him back to the tent as well. But he was the doctor. So they now have a problem because they need another one. So they went off to find a doctor. And when they came back, Arthur, the most seriously wounded in the tent, had climbed off of his stretcher and was crawling around inside, tending to the other wounded men. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. In October 1914, he found himself outside of a Belgian town called Ypres. Now, this is just when the trenches are just going in and the barbed wire. The bit that we call no man's land, they hadn't even called it that yet in the paper. So it's just that bit. But Arthur was told that there was a wounded man out, caught up in the German wire right in front of their trench. Arthur waited until it got dusk. He got a pair of wire cutters, climbed over the parapet, and just set off towards the German front line. And they started to shoot at him. And eventually an officer, German officer, worked out what he was trying to do, and he stopped his men firing. And Arthur kept going until he reached the German wire. He used his wire cutters to free the wounded man from the caught up in the wire, put him over his shoulder, and walked back towards the British lines. And he was awarded the first ever bar to the Victoria Cross. The second man to do it was a man called Noel Chavas. And here is Noel. I've got a picture of Noel. There is Noel. Noel also was a doctor. He was attached to the 10th Battalion, the King's Liverpool Regiment. And in September 1916, the 10th Battalion were asked to attack a village on the Somme called Guillemont. They went over the top and they were cut down by machine gun fire. And that night, Noel, on his own, went out into no man's land under shell fire. We are told that he got within 20 yards of the German front line. He personally was hit 19 times by shrapnel. And that night he rescued on his own 21 men. One man so badly injured, he had to amputate his leg in a shell hole before he could bring him in. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. 31st of July, 1917. If you're a military historian, you call that the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres. Most people have a different name for it. It is the first day of the Battle of Passchendaele. The 10th Battalion were to attack a village in the top right-hand corner of the salient called Saint-Julien. Noel, as always, had built his dressing station in the front line so that he could help people straight away. And whilst they were waiting, that genuinely bayonets on, whistles ready to blow, a shell came over and went down the steps of Noel's dressing station and exploded. It blew the side of Noel's face off. It fractured his skull, and it put 2 holes in his liver side of him, about the size of fists. They threw him on a stretcher. They bandaged him up. They did masses of first aid on him, bless him. And just as they were about to take him away, he climbed off the stretcher and he said, "I have to stay. These are my boys. They need me." And wounded as he was, he stayed in that dressing station for the next 3 days and 3 nights, working on the wounded as they were brought in. On the second night, a stretcher bearer team came in and they said to him, "Sir, there's a man we have found in a shell hole in no man's land who is so badly wounded, we can't even roll him on a stretcher. What do you want us to do?" Now, we believe that the answer they were expecting was, "Shoot him." Noel said, "Take me to him." They went over the top into no man's land in the dark under shell fire. They reached the man. Noel got a little lamp out of his pocket, and he did an operation on this man in the shell hole, stabilized him. They got him onto a stretcher. They got him back to the dugout. Noel did another operation on him and then sent him off down the casualty line. And we are actually told that that man survived. What Noel hadn't told anybody was that while he was doing that first operation out in no man's land, a shell had burst behind him and he'd been hit in the back of the head with a piece of shrapnel. And it wasn't until he cleared his man that he then operated on himself to remove the shrapnel from the back of his own head. At the end of the 3rd day, they said to him, "You're done. There's no one else you can help now. You can go. There's a stretcher, away you go." And Noel said, "There's people worse hurt than me. I'll walk." Now, I've done this walk from Saint Julien to a place called Brandhoek. It's about 5 miles. And whilst he was walking, there was shell fire. He threw himself on the floor and he filled these 2 holes in the side of him here with mud. He reached the dressing station. It's called number 3 Casualty Clearing Station. And the man in charge that night was Arthur Martin Leake, the only other man to have ever won 2 VCs. He did an operation on Noel that night and then looked after him the next day as Noel died of blood poisoning. Noel was awarded the bar to the Victoria Cross. The last man to do this was a man called Charles Uppam. Now, Charlie Uppam was a fighting soldier. He was a New Zealander, and in 1941, he was a sergeant on the island of Crete. And as the German paratroopers were dropping around them, he was part of the rear guard, so protecting people trying to get out of the port, a bit like Dunkirk. They reached a crossroads. Charlie Uppam had been wounded 7 times so far this day. They reached a crossroads and the Germans had got there before them. They'd set up a machine gun. And Charlie said to his boys, "That's it, chaps. It's every man for himself now, because we're done. However, someone's got to knock out that machine gun. Otherwise, nothing else is going to happen. I'll do it." So Charlie said to his boys, "You make for the port once I've knocked this thing out." He pulled out a hand grenade, pulled the pin, and ran at the German machine gun. The Germans saw him, swung onto him, opened fire, shot him through both ankles, and he still kept running. Threw the grenade into the pit, hit the floor, and blew up the machine gun. The platoon ran out, picked up Charlie, took him down to the docks. They got him back to North Africa. And in his citation for his Victoria Cross, it says, "Without the actions of Sergeant Uppam that day, at least another 10,000 Allied soldiers would have been taken prisoner." 1942, he'd been promoted. He was now a captain. He was up on something called the Russiat Ridge. This is a kidney-shaped ridge. Beyond it, to the south of it, is something called the Katara Depression, or the Great Sand Sea. So have you ever seen the film Ice Cold in Alex, where they have to push the ambulance up and down the sand dunes? That's the Great Sand Sea. You can't get a tank through there. Then there's the Russiat Ridge. Then there's about 40 miles of completely open desert till it reaches the coast. And on the coast, there's a railway station. And the railway station is called El Alamein. You can't attack 40 miles of British soldiers in depth. You can't go through the Great Sand Sea. So the key to this is the Russiat Ridge. If you can take the Russiat Ridge, you can run up behind the British soldiers, hit the coast at El Alamein, turn right and go for Cairo. And you will win World War II. Rommel attacked the Russiat Ridge in October 42. Charlie Uppam was up there. In his citation for his bar to his VC, it says, "After being wounded, he was shot through the right elbow. So his right arm didn't work. So remember what I'm about to tell you, he did with one arm. After being wounded, Captain Uppam destroyed 4 German machine gun posts, 4 German lorries, and captured 30 prisoners single-handedly. At one time, he was heard rallying the troops over the sound of artillery fire. That is going some. Now, when he went to the palace, you line up in medal order. And within medal order, you line up in rank order. And in the front of the queue was a British major there to receive the Victoria Cross. And we are told that all of a sudden, this big scruffy captain, so one rank below him, stood in front of him. And the major said, "What do you think you're doing? I am here to receive the Victoria Cross from my king." And we're told Charlie Upham turned around to him and he said, "Yep, you wait your turn, mate. I'll come for me second." Got to be the best put down line the world has ever seen. Absolutely incredible. Now, as we get to the end, because we're nearly there, I'm often asked, what is the difference between the Victoria Cross and the George Cross? Well, they do look slightly different because this is a George Cross made of solid silver. And people say to me that the George Cross is for civilians and the Victoria Cross is for soldiers, sailors and airmen. Well, that's not true, because 4 civilians have won the Victoria Cross, and about half of the 540 odd people who have won a George Cross have been service people. Today, if you are going to recommend someone for a Victoria Cross or a George Cross, the Ministry of Defence will quite happily send you an email which tells you how to do it. And in there, it says, if you are recommending somebody for a George Cross or a Victoria Cross, you must demonstrate that there was a 90% chance or greater that this person would have been killed attempting this feat. And it is exactly the same for a George Cross and a Victoria Cross. On the table of gallantry, they are exactly the same. The difference is that the Victoria Cross must be won in the face of the enemy. And the George Cross, same amount of bravery, but not in the face of the enemy. In 1943, this guy was 20 years old. His name is Arthur Aaron. He was a pilot of a Halifax bomber, 7 men in a Halifax bomber. They were quite a experienced crew. They had already done 19 trips. They had been to places like Hamburg, Essen, Berlin, the Ruhr. They knew what they were doing. On this particular night, the squadron, 12 aircraft, were tasked with a bombing mission on the oil refineries in Milan in Italy. Now, I don't live too far away from either Debden or Stansted Airport. And if you fly EasyJet, when you can, to Milan, it takes about 1 hour and 40 minutes. For them, in a 4-engine bomber, 8.5 hours round trip. And most of that is done over France in the dark where the night fighters are. Now, they were carrying a big bomb load. They were carrying a thing called a cookie, which is a 4,000-pound blast bomb. They were carrying 10 1,000-pound general purpose bombs. This is each aircraft, and 2 baskets of incendiaries. Your biggest problem is A, you've got to get across Europe, and B, you've got to get across the Alps. We're told that Arthur and his aircraft got across Europe. They got over the Alps and they started down onto their bomb run. Now, this is where you hand over sort of control to your bomb aimer. The bomb bay is open and he will give you instructions of left, left, right. And the pilot just has to fly in a perfectly straight line, nothing else. As they came onto their bomb run, bomb bay open, their aircraft was attacked. Bullets came through the windscreen. They destroyed the instrument panel. They killed the navigator. They hit the wireless set, put it out of action. They wounded the wireless operator. They put the port inner engine out of action completely. And that runs something called the APU, the auxiliary power unit, and that provides all of your hydraulic power. So that's the wheels going up and down, the flaps, the brakes, your bomb bay, open and closing, and also your gun turrets. Now, if you're in a rear turret in a big bomber, you drop into the turret and close 2 doors behind you. When you move your turret out of 0, those 2 doors behind you lock. If you want to bail out, you have to turn back the turret to 0. The solenoid works, the 2 doors open. You then lean back and grab your parachute, drag it into the turret, hook it on, swing your turret to one side, leave the door open, and roll out backwards. When the hydraulics failed on Arthur's aircraft, the rear gunner was off to one side and was now stuck in his turret. The bullets that came through the windscreen, they hit Arthur. They blew his bottom jaw off, he lost his tongue, he lost the side of his face, he lost his left arm at the elbow, and 2 bullets hit him in the chest. His aircraft rolled. He somehow righted it. The flight engineer standing next to him undid Arthur's harness, picked him up, dropped him on the floor, climbed in and started to fly the aircraft. Never flown an aeroplane before. The 3 engines now started to overheat. They grabbed hold of Arthur, dragged him back to the rest bed, did masses of first aid on him, and pulled out the morphine syringe. Now, Arthur had lost most of his face and he couldn't speak anymore, but he started with his left hand to grab hold of parachute harnesses and shake them. And eventually someone gave him a piece of paper and a pencil. And he wrote on the piece of paper, "Don't give me any morphine because you're going to need me to land this thing." They went back. They told the flight engineer, never flown an aeroplane before. So he said, right, get rid of the bombs. So they dropped the bombs and then tried to close the bomb bay, but it wouldn't shut. And that's the same hydraulic circuit as your wheels. So the chances are now no wheels. The navigator was dead. All the maps had blown away. So what they decided was it wasn't ever going to get home. So they would just use the coastline of Italy that they could see and fly straight down it until they got to the end and turn right. And there's Sicily. And we just captured that. And that was their best bet. So off they set, engines overheating. The wounded wireless operator started to try and mend his radio set, and he got it to work. He sent SOS to Sicily, and they acknowledged the SOS and then sent back, "What's your problem?" And he said, "We're on 3 engines. I'm wounded. Navigator's dead. Pilot's very badly wounded. We don't think the wheels are going to come down. We can't close the bomb bay. The flaps don't work. And the bloke who's flying it's never done it before." And they sent back, "Bail out." And he said, yes. And I quote, "Our rear gunner is stuck. And we have decided as a crew that whatever today will bring, we will do it together." They said, "Okay, all right. Well, you've got to circle the airfield because we've got to get other people in before you try this." So they started to circle the airfield and they were waiting for a squadron of Wellington bombers, been on a raid. And they watched them come in and they counted in 11 and they thought, right, our go. And the control said, "Hold." So they continued to circle. And all of a sudden, way out in the distance, there was one more Wellington bomber and he was trailing black smoke behind him. He'd been hit over the target. He came in on his approach. And as he came in to land, he was firing out red flares, which means I have wounded on board. I need an ambulance. And as he touched down, his wheels collapsed and his aircraft blew up on the runway. And with debris and flame, closed about a quarter of the runway. So what we now want our novice pilot of a couple of hours to do is to bring in a crippled bomber now on 3 overheating engines, reach a burning wreck, hop over it, and make a belly landing on the other side. So the crew told Arthur what was going to happen. And Arthur, on his bit of paper, wrote, "Put me back in the seat." So they carried him through the aircraft. They put him back in the pilot's seat. And where his left arm had been blown off at the elbow, there was a bone sticking out. So they tied a shoelace round the bone and they tied the shoelace to the control column so he could push with the stump. He came in on his approach. He leant forward and he pressed the 2 buttons for his wheels. They heard the compressed air go on either side, and he got 2 greens as his wheels locked. He reached the burning wreck, he hopped over it, and made a perfect 3-point landing on the other side. He pulled his brakes on, nothing happened. So using the throttles of the 3 remaining engines, he slewed the bomber from side to side until he got it to stop. What he didn't know is that 4,000-pound blast bomb, when they dropped it, only 1 clip had gone. So he dragged that down the runway behind him as he landed. He still knew that his aircraft could blow up. So he turned off his 3 petrol feeds, he turned off his 3 magnetos, and he pulled the levers down that opened the cooling fans on his engines. And as the propellers stopped turning, Arthur died. But he'd saved everyone on his aircraft, and they put him in for the Victoria Cross. The aircraft, however, that had shot at them that night was another Halifax bomber from their own squadron. So that is what is called friendly fire. That is not in the face of the enemy, and therefore you cannot have a Victoria Cross. So they crossed that out and wrote George Cross. And this went all the way to Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill read his story, got his green ink pen, just like Her Majesty all those years before, and he crossed out George Cross, and he wrote right across the card, Victoria Cross. We can't let the enemy know we shot down one of our own aircraft. And at the age of 20, little Arthur was awarded his posthumous VC. Now, when we started this, exactly 1 hour ago, I said to you, Her Majesty wrote in the margin of that first document, it's not about the medal, it's about the deed behind the medal. You've now heard some of the stories of the 1,365 men who have been awarded the Victoria Cross. And I hope you now believe that Her Majesty got that sentiment just about right. Brethren, thank you for listening to me.
Worshipful Brother Mark Smith, I have few words to say apart from a huge, huge thank you. If we were in the temple in Rosyth just now, having listened to you face to face, I can guarantee you that you would have been able to hear that proverbial pin drop with the attention that each and every brother has given to you this evening. I can see that from the comments that have come through already on the chat. I think I said to you in the past, I've been privileged to meet John Cruikshank VC, Royal Air Force. And I met him when he was 99 and at an event we run with Poppy Scotland, and that really inspired my interest in Freemasonry and its connections with the Victoria Cross. But there's 2 brethren on here this evening, Stuart Donaldson and Archie Chalmers, have been researching Freemasonry and the Victoria Cross for a lot longer than I have, and between the 3 of you, brethren, you have certainly enhanced my daily advancement in this very special area of research. And I think everyone, those who've served, those who have got a civilian background of the 100 and odd people that were here this evening, have been totally taken away with your passion, with your knowledge, but importantly, the stories of Valour this evening. So on behalf of the members of Lodge Hope of Karachi, Worshipful Brother Mark Smith, thank you so much, sir.
It's been a pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So, and I've seen some of the things along the bottom, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I've got a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Only the easy ones, like I said.
Well, I think there's. I will share all the comments with you by email later on as well.
Okay.
There's one there from one of our airborne brethren. If Mark does not do a second lecture, I'm blocking Gordon on Facebook. That's how serious this request is.
So you'll be pleased. I don't know if you'll be pleased. Well, maybe you'll be pleased to know that there is the second part to what you've just heard. It's called Hearts of Oak, and that's quite good too.
We would love to have you back, and I'll touch base with you after that. I think we've got some we're very proud of the connections of Scottish Freemasonry with Lord Panmure. He was a past provincial Grand Master of Forfarshire, our neighbouring province, past Grand Master Mason of Scotland. So we do feel some level of Masonic ownership to the Victoria Cross if we can have it. And we've got some amazing stories of the arguably 58 VC holders with a Scottish Masonic connection. And there's Sam McFadden just talking about 2 VC winners in a pauper's grave in Dundee Eastern Cemetery.
Okay.
So the first question that I think I said, what's your view on Paddy Mayne not getting the VC?
Okay. So, so first of all, it's about who sees you do what it is that you do. You have to be witnessed by somebody. Lionel Reese is a bit strange because he was completely on his own. Jimmy Nicholson was seen by his wingman. There was, in 1919, there was a war graves registration unit clearing the battlefield of Lewes from 1915, from 4 years before, and they cleared 19,000 bodies from an area of about 10 football pitches. And one of them they found was the body of a lieutenant colonel, and in his tunic pocket, written in pencil, was the recommendation for his sergeant to win the VC. And his sergeant is missing. They never found his sergeant, but he was awarded the VC. So it's about who is going to recommend you. Now, the problem with Paddy Mayne is that most of the people who he could be recommended by, he had punched at some time. And that tended to cloud their judgment. And they gave him DSOs up the yin, but he wasn't ever going to get it, not because of what he did, but because of who he was and who he had upset. And he personally probably didn't care, because that wasn't really the type of person he was. But that has 90% of the reason why it was his personality.
Okay, thank you.
I saw one come up there about Tallahassee Lubba Lubba at Meerbat.
Yeah.
So the other thing is that in the statute, it says that a declaration of war has to have been declared. And we never declared war in Oman. They were a training team. So the only thing you can get is mentioned in dispatches.
Okay. I think what is very telling about your presentation this evening is the lack of questions because of the detail and the awe that everybody has been sitting in. Some of the comments, wonderful stories, but the one that I just wanted to highlight, because not everybody gets the chance, Mark, to read it. And it's from Brother Colin Thompson, past master of Lodge Ness 888 up in the Highlands. And he states, Brother Mark, what a fantastic and engaging lecture, the best hour in a long time.
Yeah.
You made a statement that your father could teach you without you knowing it. You have picked up that talent from him. I have never been so engaged like this in a long time. Many thanks, Colin. And I think that sentiment goes for every single one of us on the presentation this evening. So, Brian, I don't propose to ask any more questions of Mark. I think we sit back. I'll do my very quick intimations, and then I'll unmute you all so you can say your personal thanks, and Mark can stay for 2, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, however long he wants to, as we close up for the night.
I got one question on the bottom about a pension for them.
Oh yeah.
So yes, they do get a pension. When the first ones were given out, they got 10 guineas each. And by World War II, that had gone up to 110 guineas. And now people like Johnson Bahari, they get £5,000 a year tax-free. But that is not a posthumous award. So that's only for people who are still alive. And if you get killed winning it or you die, your family doesn't get it. But that's what they get.
Yeah. No, I think it's...
The only other thing I would say to you is because you can't you can't see them other than in the picture. All of the medals that I showed you today, including the VC, are real ones in my collection. So they're not copies. They are all the real thing. There's
so many fake ones out there as well. And if you get offered it for £15 on eBay, you know that there's something far wrong, I think.
Why not work?
Yeah, you see. I think that there's one final question that's come in there, Mark, if you don't mind. You mentioned something about the inscription on the back. Can you clarify what you meant about that inscription?
Okay, so I noticed that we're recording.
Yep.
So I can't show you what's on the back of one while we're recording, but I'll do it at a distance. Okay, so here in the middle on the back is the date of the award. So this one says the 9th of October 1862, and then here on the bar it says Able Seaman George Hinckley. So the back of each one is engraved with their name, their regiment or ship or Arab or squadron, and then in the middle on the back it does actually give the date of the award, and they are all engraved in a different code. So it might say private P, big T, little e, full stop, and the next one they engrave will be big P, little t, little e, no full stop, and they keep a register of the differences, so that if you do get a copy one, or someone's trying to make one, then you've also got to be able to get that just about right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yes, there were 2 medals given to George Hinckley because he lost his first one, and this is his official replacement, which I bought in 1990.
Okay. Mark, once again, thank you so much. As someone who's got a passion about this as well, you've totally blown me away with the stories. Yeah. And I think, along with myself, each and every one of us has learned something new about our brave men that have served King and Queens. Bren, before I allow you to say your personal thank yous to Mark, next week we will venture to the Philippines, where we will have Worshipful Brother Teddy Kalau IV, a very Americanized pronunciation of his surname. Teddy comes from, it's his 4th generation Freemason in the Philippines, a member of the Grand Lodge of the Philippines, and he will come and speak to us about the history and the development of Freemasonry in that nation. So we look forward to welcoming him next week. Brethren, please be gentle as you unmute and say your thank yous and goodbyes. I'm sure Mark will stay with us for a couple of minutes so he can just hear you all say it individually. So, Bren, the floor is yours to say thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Very much. Fantastic.
Fantastic.
Thank you,
Mark. Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Absolutely wonderful. Look forward to the next one.
See you next time.
Superb.
I saw one question come up, which was how many medals had I got on the poster? So Dad and I started collecting. There's 95 medals on the poster, both campaign and gallantry, and I got the last one in November last year. So I have all of them. I have the whole lot.
Brilliant.
Absolutely marvelous.
Thank you very much indeed.
Fantastic.
Well done. Well done.
Absolutely brilliant.
Glad you enjoyed it, guys.
Has the VC ever been won by a woman?
I'm sorry, say again.
Has the VC ever been won by a woman?
No. When the statute was signed, there's a clause in there that says no woman can win one, and that was changed in 1916 by George V, and he changed the statute and admitted women. I think because of the nurses that were out in the First World War. But the problem isn't that women aren't brave.
No.
The problem is that women, until very, very, very recently, never got close enough to be in the face of the enemy. And that's the real problem. I think the closest one, and the one that I would have argued for if I'd been on the committee would have been for the Special Operations Executive SOE agent Violet Szabo. She got the George Cross, but she was wounded in a pistol battle with the SS. She was tortured in Dachau, and then they killed her.
Executed.
And I think that is in the face of the enemy.
Oh yeah.
But they gave her the George Cross. So she for me she's the closest.
Thank you for that,
Mark.
Jason.
Absolutely brilliant. Look forward to
Thank
the
you very
next one.
much, brother Mark. It was an absolute fantastic lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, matey.
We look forward to part 2.
Can't wait.
And don't make it
Thanks
too
very much.
long.
Thanks very much, Mark. That was brilliant. Thank you much, sir.
Cheers, guys.
Okay, good night.
Night, guys. See you later, boys.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye, Dougie.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much. That was superbly
Pleasure.
done. Very moving.
Thanks, Mark. Looking forward to Hearts of Oak.
Look forward to it.
Take care, one and all. Good night, Gordon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, all.
Bern, even
Night.
though it's
Good night.
we've got our special guests here this evening, we will continue with our little tradition because traditions are important. So I will give you 5, Brethren.
Thank you, Mark. That was most riveting. Thank you,
Thank
Lord,
you.
for organising.
Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely
Yeah.
superb. Thank you
Wonderful.
very much.
Yep.
Thoroughly enjoyed it.
I'll give you 4, Bern.
Good night, Gordon.
Really appreciated. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
Pleasure,
brother
guys,
Mark.
honestly.
Thank you.
Thank
Thoroughly
you very
enjoyed it.
much, Mark. That was absolutely
Evening, Brian.
fantastic. Thank you. And
Good
thank you, Gordon.
How about the
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Cheers, matey.
I'll
Thanks
give you
once
3,
again.
Bern.
Bye. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you,
Thank
brethren. Hey, Gordon.
In your
Good night,
bed,
lads.
Folks.
Good night, lads.
And 2.
That's
Thank you very much, Mark. That was excellent, superb. And there was no slides I had to watch. I could write everybody's name down and still hear everything that was going on. Brilliant. Well done, Nobby. Well done.
And 1, Bern. And with that, Worcester
night,
brother Mark
everybody.
Smith,
Right.
thank you so much for coming along to the Lodge
Thanks for
Hope
the
of
cheer.
Karachi this evening. Thank you very
Pleasure,
much,
Gordon.
sir.